Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this special event. This turnout is just amazing. Look around the room. Seriously, this is really amazing. We first would like to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking your lunch hour. We know how precious that is to everyone, to have an hour or 45 minutes during the day to just say, whew. I do it often. So welcome and thank you. And so the initial plan, so if you're going by the agenda and we get off a little bit, don't get beside yourself. It's okay. It's just how I do things, and I just go with the flow.
Thank you very much. My name is Essence Adams. I am a spoken word artist. I have been doing this for about 14 years now. So I love it. I started when I was in high school. I went to St. Paul Central for a while, and I was a part of a program called CTC, Central Touring Theater. So I originally started out in theater, and there I was introduced to spoken word poetry. And for me, I believe spoken word poetry was the key that really saved my life and also saved my academic career. I wasn't a student who was really book strong, but through the arts, I was able to really find my way and create a path for me to still learn. I later transferred to high school for recording arts, which is another St. Paul school. I don't know if any of you know where that is. I love both schools. I rep them both. So, and at high school for recording arts, I had the opportunity to not just enhance as an artist, but really take control of my academics and be in control of how I wanted to learn and what I wanted to learn. And that really created a platform for myself to really just grow and go. And so ever since then, it's kind of been a word of a mouth type of thing. People like, hey, that girl Essence. And I absolutely love it. I'm a mother of a 5-year-old. She's the bomb. If she didn't have school today, I would have brought her with me for sure. She's actually also a spoken word artist. She's been performing with me since she was 1. She's legit, guys. I'm not joking. It sounds funny, but she's the real deal Holyfield. She does. She actually she books her own shows now. So, and she makes it very clear, Mommy, it's just my time on stage. So I absolutely love it. She just turned 5 on Wednesday, so that's one of my proud moments. So I guess enough about me. I'm gonna do maybe a couple poems back to back, and the theme is looking forward. So I'm gonna take that. I have a key player who's coming in, which I'm not gonna tell you. I'm trying to stall just so that he can pull up really quick. But yeah, is that him? Oh no. All right. Well, I'm gonna do this poem first without him, and then hopefully he'll just jump right in afterwards. This first piece that I'm gonna do, it talks about me and my journey and how I allow how other people seen me to affect my reality, and not who I was. My brother told me when I was younger, he tells me, you're dark, you're lovely, and you're smart, and you're sweet. And when I went to school, my peers necessarily didn't see it like that, so I allowed their judgment on me to like make my decision. And eventually, as I grew and I matured and I was able to look at myself in the mirror and see me and not see what other people said and who they said I was able to walk into this. And so this is called Beautiful. I'm dark, lovely, smart, and sweet. You may have noticed my darkness, but not what's inside of me. I'm not asking for a chance if you're not willing to see that I want to be judged, not by my skin, but what's inside of me. You see, they say I'm dark, I'm lovely, smart, and sweet. You may have noticed my darkness, but not what's inside of me. I'm not asking for a chance if you're not willing to see that I want to be judged, not by my skin, but what's inside of me. You see, I was told that beauty lives in the eye of the beholder and not within the latest fashion. We seem to be so obsessed with diamonds, silvers, and gold that we seem to neglect our own souls. Instead of speaking up for ourselves, we stand out with our clothes. The color, the cut, the fabric, and how it feels against your skin, feeling that it made you, and once again forgetting that beauty starts within. You see, TR was 10 when she started out on her mission.
The music videos told her that a flat stomach and big boobs was all she was missing. As she was 15, she was so used to neglection that when she found out that Rockaware and Darien was all she needed, she ran for her acceptance. Monique was 12, Asia was 9, and Keisha was 10 when they all got sucked in a lion's den, feeling that they were not enough and that beauty was not their friend. You see, I too was caught up. I wasn't sure who I was, or where I was trying to go. So I showed more breasts because I thought it was best. I wore tighter jeans so that maybe, just maybe, I could be seen. And you see, the magazines is telling us how much thin is in, and it hurts to know that if you're not a size 5, that they don't carry your size. You see, I was told that beauty, true beauty, lives in the eye of the beholder and not within the latest. You see, I was told that beauty, true beauty, lives in the eye of the beholder. You're dark, lovely, smart, and sweet. You may have noticed my darkness, but not what's inside of me. I'm not asking for a chance if you're not willing to see that I want to be judged not by my skin, but what's inside of me, that I want to be judged not by my outer, but my inner. That I want to be judged not by what you see, but what I could tell you. I want to be judged not by what you think, but the character of my heart. I want to be judged not by my skin, but what's inside of me. Thank you.
Typically, I take people on a journey, so I'm gonna take you on a short journey with my poetry, if that's okay. That for me, that really spoke volume, knowing who I am and where I stood, and then being able to be okay with understanding that it's not the outer, it's the inner. And not only that, when other people see you, understanding when you see, you're only seeing the outer surface, but what's the inner? And just along with the theme, being able to, is it looking back to move forward? For me, that was a good reflection of looking back, but also my milestone to be able to move forward. So this next piece that I'm gonna do is called I'm Gonna Keep Flowing, and they just gonna jump right in with me. Give them a hand really quick. They're awesome-tastic. This next piece I'm gonna do is called I'm Done Chasing Living in My Destiny. And to me, when they asked me to do this, this was the first poem that I thought about. A lot of people talk about what they want to do. I know some people that are like, yeah, I'm gonna get a store, or I'm gonna buy a house, and then you see them 10 years later, and they're still gonna get a store, and they're still gonna buy a house. You see them 10 more years later, they're still gonna get a store, and they're still gonna be like, you know. So I, as a young person, I dedicated my art to the school system. So I started working back in the school system as soon as I graduated from high school in 2008. I started in St. Paul Public Schools, and then I transferred to Minneapolis Public Schools. And what I was able to do is to encourage young people, not only encourage their voice, but encourage them to walk out what they're talking about. And so I want to do that same thing with you guys. Don't just talk about it, be about it. And then also be mindful of the people that you have surrounded around you. So as I tell my babies, one of my babies, she told me, well, she had a son when she was 14 years old. I think she was a sophomore in high school. And she told me her senior year, she said, I had just met her senior year. She said, Miss Essence, I wanted to be a doctor, but I'm not going to be a doctor because I have a child. So I'm just going to go ahead and be a nurse. I said, what? That don't make sense. Now that you have a child, you might want to be going for that doctor's type. But she said, that's what I'm gonna do. I think that's all I can do since I have a baby. And I told her, I said, from this day forward, I'm gonna call you Dr. Parchment. I said, that's all. I'm not gonna call you Jasmine. I'm not gonna call you anything else, because I really wanted to encourage her. She's currently in school, going ahead so that she can be that doctor. And so for me, this poem really relates to that. Whatever it is that you desire to do, I dare you to do it. I dare you to. Don't wait on it. Don't think about it. Just walk in it. And so for me as a spoken word artist and as a theater head, I love theater and I act. That's what I wanted to do, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And I think it's a great reflection for my baby, who's like a woman, as she sees me living out exactly what it is that I love to do, so I can encourage her and other people around me. And when you do that, you'll be surprised how you're able to impact others around you. So this piece is called Done Chasing. I hope you enjoy it. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. chasing, just living in my destiny. From a young lady to a woman, no need to question me. You see, spoken word poetry is the best in me. Truth spitting, wisdom given. Creating lyrics from the soul, taking broken pieces and making them whole. You see, I have a story to be told. No longer aiming for fame, I don't need them screaming my name. You see, the truth lives in my vein, and my tongue can't be tamed. Straight knowledge, symbolic for the truth. You see, I'm spitting the realest lyrics, and some of you lame spirit, but don't mirror it. Allow my reflection to be your daily dose blessing. I got answers, so stop questioning. My mind, body, and soul respect it. See, at every moment, I'm being tested. But at every moment, my God is perfecting it. The paparazzi's there after me. They're yearning to know my history. Her story. It's clear to me that this is my destiny. You see, God said patience is a virtue, so it's all about time. And see, you're looking for the next one, but the star is me. You're looking for the next one, but the star is me. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. 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 You see, this is not just a show for you watching a pod. I'd be considered a fraud if I mislabeled this gift from God. This is my art, a way of living and breathing and constantly breeding new strategies to gradually approach the issues proceeding. To invade our minds so that Satan can rob us, destroy, and kill. Because the good book says it's his occupation for real. And while he's stealing other things, you who are stealing my joy, by controlling me, setting me up like a wind-up toy, turning a handle in my head, also known as my mind, and let me unwind and spit a couple fiery rhymes. And when I'm done, you want me quiet and in a frozen position, placing me crazily in this awkward submission without the permission to be my spoken word agent. And all the while, I'm practically slaving to receive nothing but a standing ovation. Which used to be enough for me, but you've taken that beauty away, turning my passion into a product. Now you put me on display. Hey, I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. Can y'all say that? I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. I'm done chasing. Let me hear you. Make me a believer. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. Can y'all? I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. I'm done chasing. I want to hear y'all. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. Say it again. Say it again. They tell you that there's power in the tongue. So if this is something that you say, this is something that you can live. Say it again. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. I'm done chasing, just living. Say it with some umph. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. 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 Think about that. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. I'm done chasing, just living in my destiny. They say when you dream chase, you have to be asleep. So in order to live in your destiny, that means you have to be awoke and alive and walk that thing out. So I dare you to stop dream chasing and live in your destiny. Thank you all.
And I'd like to read just a little bit from her bio before we welcome her. Judge Lang is a retired state of Minnesota trial court judge. She is an internationally recognized expert in human rights and international development, conducting assessments and programs. She has served as a co-vice chair of the Minnesota Supreme Court Task Force on Racial Bias in the Courts, the Minnesota Supreme Court Task Force on Gender Fairness in the Courts, the Women Judges Association of Minnesota State Bar Association's Board of Governors, and the National Bar Association, among others. Please, let's give a warm welcome for Judge LaJune Lang.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that warm welcome.
Good afternoon.
I'd like to begin my talk about Dred Scott to give you a little history so that when you hear about Dred Scott and his family, you'll have some context. African descendant people were in the Americas before the Mayflower. So there is a long documented history of African descendant people being present, contributing, and thriving to the country that we refer to as the United States of America. In 1776, when the Revolutionary War was taking place, there was a noted disagreement between the revolutionary forces and the African descendant community that was living in New York. The British, in order to get the African descendant people to be sympathetic to their cause, promised that the African descendant people, if they supported the British, could be free. When the African descendant people asked Americans, what is our future in this new country that you're creating? They said, well, same old, you'll be slaves if you're not some other category. And so many African descendant people elected to be on the side of the British and were ultimately relocated in the 1700s to a place called Nova Scotia. Do you know where Nova Scotia is? And we have continuous thriving black descendant communities in Nova Scotia and other parts of Canada that were from people who were well settled, who owned their own homes, who had large plots of land, who were contributors. And we also had African descendant people who elected to stay in the state of New York and the city of New York and to try to navigate through all the various systems of freedom, slavery, and some of those African descendant people owned the land which is now proudly proclaimed to be Central Park. And what the nice, good people in New York did was continually pass laws to disinherit the African descendant people who owned that land, till finally they got a law passed that said black people could not pass land on through their estates to their heirs. So we were dispossessed of Central Park. And so when we talk about Dred Scott, people often like to talk about Dred Scott as a person who didn't know how to read and who just kind of was floating through history with this particular case. And don't give him the agency or the understanding to bend the arc of history, which is what Dred Scott did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Dred Scott, and I'm going to talk about the case. So no individual litigant in American constitutional history has equaled the fame of the African descendant man known as Dred Scott. His suit for freedom from the shores of the Mississippi River in St. Louis to the chambers of the U.S. Supreme Court rocked the nation in the 1850s. Who was Dred Scott? The institution of slavery in America did not consider the details of a life of a slave to be relevant. So there are many gaps in terms of the recorded history on the life of Dred Scott. The records that we do have are articles that relate to ownership. bills of sale, location of the residence of his owners, and events involving the white people in Dred Scott's life. One of those white people was a man by the name of Peter Blow. Peter Blow arrived in St. Louis from Alabama in 1830 with 6 slaves, 5 males and 1 female. He set up a boarding house in St. Louis, but he died in 1832. And after Blow's death, his executor sold 2 male slaves to settle the claims against the estate. One slave was recorded as being called Sam, and the other had no recorded name. The historical record is not clear which one of these 2 slaves was purchased in 1833 by Dr. John Emerson in St. Louis, Missouri. But we do know that one of those slaves who was purchased at that time in 1833 was named, after purchase by Dr. Emerson, was given the name Dred Scott. Dred Scott had grown up with Peter Blow's family, and this sale severed the legal ties to that family, but they never lost touch. In 1834, Dr. Emerson was posted to Fort Armstrong in the Free State of Illinois. And in 1836, Fort Armstrong was closed, and Dr. Emerson moved with Dred Scott to Fort Snelling in the Wisconsin Territory, then renamed the Iowa Territory, and then became the state of Minnesota. Yes, that is the same Fort Snelling that you drive past every time you go to the airport. That is Fort Snelling, and that is where Dred Scott lived. Fort Snelling was in free territory, yet we know from the historical record that at least 30 slaves lived at Fort Snelling at one time or another. So much for our teachers telling us there were no slaves in Minnesota or in the north, because there were documented slaves at Fort Snelling. Why so many slaves at a federal U.S. Army post in free territory? The answer is simple: money. Money, money, money. The Army provided a servant allowance of up to 1/3 your monthly pay if you had domestic help. What a great way to increase your income if your domestic help worked for free. And so the system of slavery at Fort Snelling firmly took root. While living at Fort Snelling, Dred met Harriet Robinson, a teenage girl also held as a slave by the resident Indian agent, Major Taliaferro. Harriet was sold to Dr. Emerson and given as a wife through a contract of marriage with a formal wedding ceremony with Major Taliaferro performing as Justice of the Peace. Her name became Harriet Scott. They lived at Fort Snelling in the basement below Dr. Emerson's quarters. And that residence at Fort Snelling still exists. And through our efforts with the Minnesota African American Museum and the International Leadership Institute and the Fort Snelling Historical Society, we had the state of Minnesota declare Dred and Harriet Scott Day in the state of Minnesota, commemorating the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution a couple of months ago, and also took visitors to the Dred Scott residence who lived here all their lives and didn't know that Dred and Harriet Scott lived at Fort Snelling and that their residence still is accessible to the public. And so the space they lived in was about a 20 by 20 brick room with dusty bricks of this type, not as well maintained, and a fireplace and a door. And of those who've seen slave cabins and everything, you think, not so bad. But think, this was Minnesota. This was Fort Snelling on the edge of the river where the wolves and the bears and the elements howled at their worst. So Dred would have to tend a fire 24/7 for 7 or 8 months of the year just to keep from freezing, in addition to all the work that he had to do as a slave. Dred and Harriet Scott stayed alone at Fort Snelling when Dr. Emerson was sent to Louisiana and he found himself a wife. Staying alone meant that as a slave, he was now technically transferred to the custody of another soldier at Fort Snelling who would be responsible for his slave labor and probably the extra wages that they would earn. The Scotts were summoned to help Dr. Emerson's wife, and they had to leave. And you know, if you're a slave, you can't say it's not a good time. So in the middle of the winter, when Harriet is 8.5 months pregnant, they had to make the journey by riverboat to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri. And Harriet gave birth on the riverboat to a little girl who they named Eliza. And this little girl was born above the Mason-Dixon line. And the family also had 2 other children, 2 sons who died in infancy, and a second daughter who was named Lizzie. The Scotts remained in Missouri with Dr. Emerson's wife, and Dr. Emerson was sent by the military to Florida and then to Davenport, Iowa, where he died in 1843. Dred Scott was not freed by Dr. Emerson in his will. And Chris and I were talking about the conversations that take place out of the hearing of the masters. And one of those conversations that I believe took place was a conversation between Dred Scott and George Bonga. And George Bonga's parents were able to get their freedom through the death of the owner through his will. But this was not the case for Dred Scott. And so he, not being freed by the will, approached the widow and said, I would like to buy my freedom. Now remember, Dred Scott has been a slave all this time, and even today, the net worth of black single women is like $5. So back in the 1800s, Dred Scott is coming as a man and saying, I want to buy the freedom of my family. And one of the figures that's mentioned in the record is a sum of $300. And that would be approximately $7,000 in today's money. So Dred Scott was prepared to pay $7,000 for his family's freedom. And Irene Scott refused. So time goes by from 1843 to 1846, and then Dred Scott and Harriet Scott filed 2 identical lawsuits in the St. Louis, Missouri State Court. Now, the importance of this is to understand that Dred Scott was strategic. He wasn't going for the ham sandwich, get myself free and my family is all messed up in this whole institution we call slavery. So Dred Scott got lawyers to file a suit for himself, and he got lawyers to file a suit for his wife. Now, since 1825 in the state of Missouri, black people were deemed incompetent to testify against whites in court proceedings. So you don't back yourself into the courthouse. You have to be intelligent, you have to be strategic, And you have to have the resources to get the correct white people to go in and tell your story, because you cannot do it yourself. You cannot be a witness in the courthouse. So it was also against Missouri law to teach a slave to read. So consistently, the narrative about Dred Scott is that he was illiterate. Well, he was illiterate by the edict of the law, because anyone, including himself, who said, I knew how to read, he'd be in jail. So Dred Scott could not pursue this case by placing himself in jeopardy. So that was not refuted. So how does a man who is forced by law to keep his intellect under a veil proceed? It is undisputed that for 11 years, Dred and Harriet Scott and their children maintained a serialized litigation in the state courts and in the federal courts, and 2 sets of arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, using 3 different sets of attorneys. The only constant faces and minds on this long series of litigation during this 11-year battle was Dred and Harriet. So it was like the Pony Express. Certain lawyers could go in certain courts, and then they had to change. Meanwhile, Dred and Harriet are still slaves. This litigation in 1846 in the state court in Missouri, in order to be a freedom suit, had to claim that Dred and Harriet Scott had been assaulted by their owners and detained against their will. So it's almost a battery and kidnapping case that they had to file against Irene Scott. And so to get lawyers to file those kind of cases, you had to be pretty convincing of the rightness of your cause, the timing of it, and the importance to the nation and to people that this cause go forward. And so these freedom suits were fairly common in the state of Missouri. But by the time Dred Scott's case made it up to the Missouri Supreme Court in 1852, guess what? We had the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. We had the replacement of Supreme Court justices, and we had some of those loud-talking, whiskey-drinking judges who liked their own repartee and who were more favorable to the cause of the South. So when the new conservative justices ruled against Dred Scott in 1852, they noted in their opinion that times had changed. They would now follow the once free, always free precedent the court had established in earlier freedom suits. Now, as a judge, we call this judicial activism, if you don't follow the precedent that has been established. But they had the power, they had the last word, and so they said times had changed. So 5 years passed from 1852 to 1857 when the U.S. Supreme Court made their decision. Dred Scott, Harriet Scott, their children had to keep on living. You understand, during this period, there were lynchings, there was lawlessness, there were all kinds of threats. We talked to the great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott, and she said they had to put the children into hiding lest they be kidnapped under the fugitive slave law and sold off. So not only did they have to deal with their personal safety, deal with the litigation, but they also had to take extreme measures to protect their children. In 1854, after the Scots had filed the suit in federal court and lost, because how many of you know the only way you get your case before the U.S. Supreme Court is that you lose, and then you appeal, and you hope that the Supreme Court will give a ruling. But if you win, you don't appeal your case. So many historians who criticized Dred Scott really didn't understand what Dred Scott was trying to do. Dred Scott knew what the odds were. He knew what the courts were going to do, and he wanted the courts to be on record firmly in their positions with regard to citizenship, rights, and slavery. And so in 1854, after the case had started to work itself up, then in Washington, D.C., in order for your case to be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, again, Washington is segregated. Black people can't argue their case in the court. They can't step foot in the courthouse. And even when I went to court in RAB versus City of St. Paul, the cross-burning case, the only black person who wasn't a servant or an usher was Clarence Thomas. So not much has changed over time. But in 1854, just like now, to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court, you have to be admitted to practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's an elite circle. So Dred Scott had to find a lawyer admitted before the U.S. Supreme Court to take his case to get into the court to be heard. And he hadn't found a lawyer by December in 1854. He put together with his supporters a 12-page pamphlet. There's dispute because Dred is regarded as illiterate of whether Dred wrote it himself or others. But I will read to you what has been quoted to me. I have no money to pay anybody in Washington to speak for me. My fellow men, can any of you help me in my day of trial? Will nobody speak for me at Washington, even without hope of other reward than the blessings of a poor man and his family? This appeal reached one particular lawyer on Christmas Eve of 1854. Dred Scott's appeal for help reached a lawyer by the name of Montgomery Blair, a prominent lawyer and former West Point cadet. After years of practice in St. Louis, Blair had moved to Washington and established a practice before the U.S. Supreme Court. Blair gave the Scotts a Christmas present of his services in the case without a fee. The case reached the clerk's office on December 30th of 1854. So Christmas Eve is December 24th. Christmas Day was, I'll take your case, and he signed on and filed the papers on December 30th of 1854. We call that divine intervention where I come from. So after being filed, his case languished for more than a year. And then finally, arguments were scheduled for February of 1856. Oops. Presidential election year. Problem with deciding the Dred Scott case when we're trying to elect a president. Sound familiar? Yes. Supreme Court then was having the same problems the Supreme Court is having now. So 5 of the 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court were Southerners with slave-holding histories. There was no doubt about the outcome. So when people tell you Dred Scott lost, Dred Scott knew what the ruling was going to be before the case was filed. He knew the makeup of the court. His supporters knew the makeup of the court. And the question was, how far would the U.S. Supreme Court wade into the political debate about slavery? And I will conclude by saying that the Supreme Court stepped in it all the way up to their kneecaps and ruled that a black man has no right that a white man is bound to respect. And they said even a free black man couldn't be a citizen of the United States. And then Justice Taney reared back and said, you weren't at the table when the Constitution was written, you weren't mentioned in the Constitution, you weren't mentioned in the Bill of Rights, you weren't mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, so there is no pathway to citizenship for you black people. And so it set the table for the Civil War, because the Supreme Court had said there were no rights. And so we had an election after the Dred Scott case that elected Abraham Lincoln, and the rest is history. Thank you.
Next, I would like to welcome Chris Crutchfield.
Thank you.
Chris Crutchfield is the Deputy Director for Community Relations and External Affairs for Ramsey County Community Corrections Department. He is also an adjunct faculty member at St. Cloud State University, where he teaches media law and ethics in the Mass Communications Department. Prior to joining Ramsey County in 2006, Chris was a partner at Capitol Heights Law Group, where he litigated and counseled small business and nonprofit clients. During the past 20 years, Chris has directed Underground Railroad reenactments using environmental education methods. The program aims to teach about this chapter of American history by stimulating an escape on the Underground Railroad at night in the woods. Chris and his staff facilitate approximately 12 reenactments per year for a variety of church, school, and other groups. Let's give a warm welcome for Chris Crutchfield.
I am so honored to be here. And it's very difficult to follow someone like Judge Lay. But I would like to finish the story a little bit by saying that luckily with winning of the Civil War, there was the passage of the 13th Amendment, which freed African Americans. A lot of people think that the Emancipation Proclamation did it, but it was really the passage of the 13th Amendment. And then that was quickly followed by the 14th Amendment, which gave us all equal protection under the law and gave all natural-born citizens, naturally born persons, the right of citizenship in the United States. So that made all people, including African Americans, who were men, not women yet. I'm sorry. That was the 15th Amendment. Made us all citizens, men and women. And then it was the 15th Amendment that allowed African American men the right to vote. It wasn't until that was back in the 1860s. It wasn't until when when women got the right to vote? 1920 that women got the right to vote. So I'm really happy to be here, and I know time is short. I help facilitate a program called the Underground Railroad Reenactment, which talks about the Underground Railroad in general. And I wanted to briefly touch on that and show a very short video about what we do. And then I wanted to talk about the Underground Railroad in Minnesota. So let me see if this works. So the Underground Railroad reenactment was developed by my friend Kamau Kambui back in the 80s as an environmental education piece for children and adults. So that's a picture of Kamau, who you saw in the video. And unfortunately, we lost him about 15 years ago. He died to lymphoma. And we continue the program in his memory. We do between 1 and 2 dozen programs a year. I could spend hours talking about our program, but I thought I'd show you a video of what we do, and we're very proud of it because I think it teaches in a real visceral, deep way about not just the Underground Railroad, but about what freedom means to all of us, and that's a universal thing. All right, so what was the Underground Railroad? And a lot of times with both adults and children, they like to wonder where the train was and how they got on the train. And the Underground Railroad was not actually a train that went underground. That's actually a term. It was a term for a system, a network of people that help fugitives escape. And it became, very, very well organized with lots and lots of systems. And they had codes, and they had very specific positions of conductors and safe house holders and things like that. But I think the Underground Railroad was bigger than that. It was the idea that slavery, am I in the way? Slavery was the law of the land, but it was wrong. And there were so many people, when faced with the decision, when someone knocked on their door late at night and wanted some food, or was hiding in their barn, or was lost in the woods, people made the decision to help them, to do the right thing, which was breaking the law. And it wasn't like it was just do the right thing and tell your friends at a cocktail party. You put yourself in jeopardy when you helped people escape slavery. Your barn would be burned down. You could be put in jail. People were tarred and feathered for helping slaves. And so while there was an Underground Railroad, and that's something that was incredible, there were also hundreds and thousands of other people that helped and did the right thing when they were faced with the issue of helping fugitives escape. And I think we should keep that in mind when talking about the Minnesota ties to the Underground Railroad. All right, so let me see this. All right, so I have three things: what we suspect about what happened in Minnesota, what we know happened in Minnesota, and what we can learn from the little we know. So I've been doing the Underground Railroad for 25 years, the reenactment program, and so it's happened on a regular basis where people have approached me following a program and said, my uncle, my aunt, my grandmother had a house that was a safe house in the Underground Railroad here in Minnesota. And they would, and I've gone and seen some of these houses. There's one in Stillwater, there's one in Elk River, they're around. And so you have these houses that carpenters are finding when they go to do remodeling, secret rooms, right? Secret places down in the cellar and down in the basement. Unfortunately, we have not been able to find any writing or documentation as to how those rooms were used, right? But we do know that there were plenty of safe houses in Iowa, right? And Congregationalists were people, Quakers get a lot of credit for helping with the Underground Railroad. Congregationalists really helped out as well. As a matter of fact, here's a picture of a safe house. It was built to be a house and a safe house in southern Iowa. The house looks very normal, but you can see on the side of the house there's a cellar door, and that was actually covered by some brush, and so the conductors could bring fugitives right into the basement where they had a safe house, right? That was a safe area for the fugitives, and that's one of maybe a dozen, and you can actually tour many of these safe houses down in Iowa. But so we know that there are houses in Minnesota that have these secret rooms. We don't have documentation, but it makes sense given the age of the house and where the rooms are, that they could have been safe houses. Okay, another thing that we know, and this is one map of the Underground Railroad routes, and if you notice, Minnesota isn't there, right? So a traditional map of the well-traveled routes of the Underground Railroad do not include Minnesota. However, the National Park System does have a map with the Underground Railroad actually swinging up into Minnesota, which makes sense because of the Mississippi River. And that we know down in Cairo, Illinois, that was a hotbed where the Ohio and Mississippi come together right down there, that was a big place where the Underground Railroad would house fugitives and send them different places. And it makes sense that riverboats would be a way that they would send fugitives up north and from there to Canada or Chicago or places like that. All right, what we know. What we know is that Pilgrim Baptist Church was started by a group of slaves who had escaped out of Missouri, right? So this is Robert Hickman, and he led the group in 1863, and they came right up, like I was saying, right up the river from Missouri, and they actually ran into a riverboat and were towed. So towed into the flats of St. Paul is this raft, and on the raft were all of these escaped slaves trying to get to freedom. And they were here, and they stayed here, and not only did they live and thrive, but they founded what would be Pilgrim Baptist Church. Right? We also know that there was a second group that a very similar thing happened. They didn't form this church, but they came up on a raft were towed up by a riverboat they were escaping fugitives, and they settled here in Minnesota. All right, what else we know? In 1850, there's a population of approximately 50 African Americans in the state, with a large amount of them being in St. Paul, in and around the river. In the 1850s, and it's a real labor of love going back through my books and doing research on this stuff. And one of the things I found out that I did not know was that there were actual slaveholders that kept slaves as slaves up in Stearns County near St. Cloud. But we actually had slaves that were brought up and that worked on farms and that were house servants, not just incidentally, but lived their lives as slaves in Minnesota in the 1850s in Stearns County, I'm sorry. Also, we had other slaves coming in, as the judge said, to Fort Snelling fairly regularly, as well as, and this is really interesting, that slave owners would a lot of times travel to Minnesota on vacation to escape the heat of the Deep South and would bring their servants with them. And so that was something that was fairly regular as well. All right, and then finally, I thought that this was an interesting tidbit I wanted to add, is that there was a black family that actually, it was a big farm, I think it was a raspberry farm, was one of the big settlements in Edina. And they helped settle the area that's Morningside and Edina until they all got kicked out of where they helped settle. But that the original history was of a very strong and very active black family in Edina, and that's actually the area that Francis Wheaton came from, and Francis Wheaton was he was the first African American elected to the House of Representatives. He was from that area. All right, so the one solid document we have about Underground Railroad history in Minnesota comes from the remembrances of a man named Joseph Farr, talking about his experiences working, helping fugitives escape in Minnesota. In 1895, the Pioneer Press, it was a gentleman named Return Holcomb was the author. He interviewed Joseph Farr about his remembrances back in his 20s. So unfortunately, he's thinking back 40 years, right? And this is the document we have. And so I pulled up 40 years ago, right? If you all remember 1976, think about you remembering back to 1976, back when Elvis died, and it was a presidential election for Carter and Mondale and the bicentennial. So it's really going back in his mind that far. And the level of detail is not there. But Joseph Farr had a pretty good memory because they were able to back up many of his stories and the names with actual events and with census data. Joseph Farr was a young man. He was in his early 20s, and he cut hair at a gentleman named William Taylor's barbershop. And it was located very close to where we are right now. And it was right in the river flats, right near the old post office. And I think what's really fascinating is that William Tyler, who was actually much more active, he was the uncle of Joseph Farr, he was much more active in the Underground Railroad. He died in 1862 during the Sioux conflict. He was killed up in the Sioux conflict. And I say that just to talk about the confluence and how, and I was talking to the judge, I just would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in the 1850s or the 1840s when you had Dred Scott and George Bonga, and you had a lot of the Native Americans in like Hole in the Day and the other famous Native American chiefs all in and around Fort Snelling. Or even a gentleman who, like William Taylor, who died in 1862, was so involved in Minnesota history that he was up with the Indian agents and was killed during that conflict. But in any event, the barbershop was right there, kind of where the bus is, I think, or it might have been across the street. I think it was right there. And the barbershop was the clearinghouse for fugitives trying to escape on the Underground Railroad. And the three stories that Mr. Farr tells, the first one is about a woman who came up in a riverboat, and again, they had a person in Galena, right, on a specific riverboat that would disguise folks that came up, and they disguised a woman as a man. So he had a black man coming very well dressed, but in fact, when they were able to secret her to a safe house, it was a woman, and she was very upset, trying to get away from her owner, who was looking for her. And so they had her across the street. So actually, she was in a house right there, and then across the street from the barber shop. And the story that Joseph tells is that the owner, the slave owner, comes into the barber shop knowing that this is kind of where the people are running the helping fugitives escape, and offers the barbers $30 for her return. And Joseph looks up and out the window, and you can see the woman clearly in the house, in the window, the front window of the house across the street. And so they send one of the barbers quickly to hide the woman. And the next day, that very day, they go get a rig from the livery stable and bring her out to a French-Canadian's house named George Fournier, who lived out, they called it the White Bear neighborhood. I think that was probably the east side off of White Bear, right? That's where you're going to hide somebody's the east side, let me tell you, right? Still happens today, right? And the French-Canadian hid her for several weeks until the sheriffs got wind that she was out there, and then Fournier took her deep, deep out into the woods and kept her for 3 or 4 days until the heat was off. They brought her back to St. Paul and got her to Chicago. So that was very good, right? The second story he tells is of a woman who was a servant. And it would happen, like I said, very often that slaveholders would bring their servants with them into Minnesota. And they grabbed her and convinced her that she should escape and they could get her to freedom. But while they were making arrangements, she got homesick. And she felt that her owners had treated her well, and she left and went back to be with her owners. The third story he tells to talk about the trials and tribulations they had was of a gentleman that was also a servant that they grabbed from a hotel that wanted to escape. They made arrangement for him, and they sent him out to Prescott, Wisconsin, at a safe house in Prescott, Wisconsin. Unfortunately, his owners offered, I think it was another $30 or $50 reward, and the gentleman in Wisconsin was hard up for money. And he turned him in for the reward. Those are the 3 stories we have to go on about the Underground Railroad activity in Minnesota. And the question is, what can we learn from those stories? First of all, I think that it was great because it was a barbershop. A barbershop is perfect for an endeavor like the Underground Railroad because it's a constant place where people are coming in. You can sit and talk and meet. There's an excuse because everybody's waiting to get their hair cut. But at the same time, it's a regular general meeting place where word can get out and connections can be made. It also shows if you had a barbershop with 3 black barbers that there are enough black people in St. Paul to support 3 barbers, and there's enough organization around that. So I think that's number one. The second thing is it's fascinating because Joseph Farr said, well, we weren't an organized society or anything, but we had a man in Galena who would disguise the fugitives. And we had another man down in the river who would meet them when they came here. And they had a safe house right in St. Paul, and they worked with the man in the livery that gave them the rig, and they had Mr. Fournier that was up in White Bear, and they had the guy in Prescott who turned the other person in. But still, it sounded like they, for not being very organized, were pretty well organized. So all that to say that even though we don't have anything other than those records, we do know that there is some evidence that slaves came upriver as fugitives with the Pilgrim Baptist Church. And we do have a person's remembrances, even though they aren't specific, of helping dozens and dozens of fugitives and having as many as 6 or 8 different contacts helping him all over the city of St. Paul, down by the wharves, and even stretching to Galena, as well as having contacts to get these folks to Chicago and up to Canada, which is what happened with the woman originally.